Welcome everybody, I'm glad you found us. If you haven't been here before, this is a pretty expansive, beautiful property for you to paint today. My name is Kim, if you don't know me, I'm the Vice President. And we are super fortunate today to have with us amazing plein air painter, among other things. Jared Cullum is with us. Jared is not only an amazing plein air painter, he's a cartoonist. He has a graphic novel called Cody that has won awards and is published in multiple languages. At this point, you're on the sequel, correct?
Yes.
So he's got that. He does amazing still lifes. He teaches. He's proficient in gouache and watercolor. You can find him on Patreon. You can find his YouTube channel, Jared Loves to Draw. So he's very accessible and he's very good. So with that, I'm going to let Jared show you what he's brought. It looks like he's brought quite a few examples of what he does. And enjoy your morning.
Thank you so much. Thank you everybody for having me here. I'm really excited. This place is amazing. I didn't even know it was here. It was, I've plein air painted in Moon Park before, but I haven't been out here before. This place is amazing. So, when we go out, there's some cool stuff. The house is amazing. I'm probably going to do the house in a minute, so I thought we could all do the house. You could paint with me if you want to paint with me. I wanted to talk a little bit about the kind of system and method for getting down a sketch simply and quickly, which helps, whether you're in the hot sun in Texas or in, 6 degrees in Alaska. I have like a working method that I use to try to simplify a scene, sort of snapshot, capture what I see, and then try to get it down quickly when I'm working plein air. Plein air painting for me is fun. It's kind of my, it's my own playground. It's like my own sandbox that I can have fun in. And I could draw with a pink highlighter if I want to. I can do whatever I want because it's more a place I can kind of experiment and play with. I do watercolor for my day job, so I have to spend all day working in watercolor in entertainment art. So working in kids' books, young adult books, sometimes stuff for animation, concept art, things like that. So when I'm doing that stuff, I have teams of editors that I have to submit to. I have 4 people who are constantly telling me, oh, what if the shirt was green, or what if we changed the camera angles? I didn't say much.
Okay, I'm sorry. I don't think it's my car. I think it's the 4-door red Subaru LDP 2719. The winner is...
Yeah, I was at my walking street.
Yeah.
Okay.
They're waiting for you up there then.
Go after that.
There's a gentleman up there who will direct you.
Okay.
Yep.
I didn't see anybody up there, but I think if you should just drive like down the road. I can't.
You won't miss it. You won't miss it.
Sorry about
No,
that.
so sorry.
Oh, you're totally fine. So I work in entertainment art, drawing cartoons during the day, and mostly at night, honestly. I have 2 young kids, so it is impossible to get work done at the house. So usually I work overnight when they're asleep. But when I'm doing plein air painting, I don't have people over my shoulder telling me to change the camera angle or do whatever, and I can kind of do whatever I want. But what I have found that I really love that sort of marries those 2 dynamics or those 2 worlds is whether I'm working in cartoons or if I'm working in landscape painting, traditional painting, the idea is kind of the same thing, which is that I'm trying to do my best to take the complexity of reality, this sort of infinite complexity of color and value, and all the colors you can take in your eye, and all the value shades you can take in your eye, and I'm trying to simplify it down. So there's 2 obvious different languages, given that when I'm working in cartoons, I'm talking about shape language as well, using much more simple shapes to create a silhouette or an identity for something people can relate to. But it's the same idea in my mind when I'm painting cartoons or painting a farmhouse or a barn or a donkey or a car or a building in Manhattan. Is I'm always trying to go for that simple shape, and what's the simple idea, because that's where I find the communication to be between what the goal is, me and the other person. So when I plein air paint, I like to think of it like I'm trying to tell a story. And the same way, working in cartoons, I'm trying to tell a story. So I'm trying to communicate with people by telling a story. And to tell that story, I want to bring that person to that place immediately. And one kind of idea that I go back to or think a lot about is the power and simplicity of a haiku poem. So, probably haven't thought about it since high school, but is everybody familiar like with a haiku poem, right? You have just a couple lines, just so many restricted syllables. But the idea is that it's supposed to be a one-breath poem, right? It's just one short poem, but in those restrictions is where the power is. That's where you can communicate emotion, feeling. You can transport a person to a place. You could write an idea that communicates the fullness of a novel, say like Moby Dick, for example. You could write a haiku poem, and in those restricted lines, you can transport someone to a place where they feel the ocean breeze, they hear the gulls, everybody knows a person with way too much ambition, everybody knows what it's like to be around that person or be that person at some points in our life. You can transport a person to that person there with a haiku poem, similar to the way the actual novel does. The novel is like 400 or 500 pages, right? So that's how I think of plein air painting and sketching. To me, it's like trying to write a haiku poem that connects with people. So I don't have language as my tool, right? So there's this book by Stephen King called On Writing, and it's very good. And in it, he talks about how writing is like solving a problem. So it's the same problem-solving mentality one would approach if you were trying to fix a sink or something. And you have a toolbox, and your toolbox, in that case, is grammar and style, that kind of thing. I think of plein air painting as telling a story is solving the problem. That's what we're trying to do. And the tools I have are shape design, and simplicity, and then of course color. So what I then want to do is take that complexity and break it down. And my main preferred method is to break it down into 4 or 5 values. So that is my restriction, is my haiku verses, right? Instead of using words, I have 4 or 5 values. And values is the powerhouse of what we're working with when we're sketching. Values, I've heard this quote before, values is the cake and color is the icing. So what I want to do is I want to make sure I'm going into this thing with a strong, solid value statement that immediately transports the person to this location, simplifies the idea into just 4 simple, what I like to call them my buckets of value, right? Because what we're doing is everything is relative. That's kind of the most frustrating thing when it comes to teaching. I know everybody here knows what I'm talking about because nobody here is a total beginner. I assume if you are, then this might be new to you. But the problem, I think, with painting that we have to deal with is I think when you're changing a painting and you're adjusting things like value and color is it's all relative. So it's kind of like a big mixing board, and when you're changing one of the dials, it changes all the rest of the dials. So you always have to deal with the fact that color and value is relative. So to try to work through that, I try to boil it down into just 4 simple values. And it's important that you get those 4 values because you need to ignite the full spectrum of value. One of the main problems I see students have with value and structure is they don't push the values hard enough. The problem is if you're comparing within like a certain range and you're not getting it anchored with those deeper, darker values, then you don't have anything to compare the rest to, and you end up with a sketch or painting that looks kind of bleached out. So I'm using watercolor, so I then have to apply the restriction of less water. So each subsequent layer of watercolor will require dehydrating the palette, which is a way more complicated way to say less water as you go, to get those strong, impactful kind of notes of color, where you really want to drive it, because the lights in a scene don't look light unless you have the darks, and the darks don't look dark unless you have the lights. You have to have the two to play against one another. They work against one another and together at the same time, in the same way color complements do, color opposites do. So the next thing I try to think about is the fact that when and we'll talk more about this when I'm actually doing the sketch. When I'm doing a scene, I always try to pick why I'm doing that scene. So before I get into it, I always want to ask myself, what is it about this thing that interests me? And I want to make sure that I spotlight that in some way. That's my highlight. That's where I want to highlight my contrast, my stronger lights and stronger darks. It's where I want to draw the focus to and allow the rest of the sketch to kind of fall apart because, again, I'm trying to tell a story and I'm setting up a drama when I'm making a sketch. So no matter where it is, even if it's just sketching some boots on the porch, which I'm currently wearing because it's raining, but even if you're just sketching some boots, you're creating a drama that you're trying to connect to people. So that kind of works in two ways. One is I want to make sure I have a thing that draws the focus. So it's kind of like setting the stage for a Romeo and Juliet play, and I have Romeo and Juliet on the classic balcony scene. And then what I want is to spotlight that drama in that moment. And I don't want some guy in a tree costume like juggling and riding a unicycle beside them because it's distracting. So I want to make sure I have a drama that I'm highlighting. And I want to make sure that I'm exploiting the various contrasts I can use. So my tools to tell a story and communicate effectively are in contrasts. So exploiting the drama of contrasts. So a lot of contrasts can come from playing opposites against one another. So I often try to think about opposites when I'm doing a sketch or when I'm doing a study, because I spend a lot of time doing master studies. So taking a big book of Winslow Homer, either from the library or I've since collected a bunch of them, or Andrew Wyatt or somebody. And I like to do little business card sized sketches to try to explore what contrasts they exploit to create drama in their scene. So some of the contrasts that jump out to me, and maybe you'll think of some as we're sketching today, is warm and cool, dark and light, which we talked about. So playing up the values, the dark and the light, that's my contrast that adds drama to the scene. Also, thick to thin, big to small. Those are some other dramas that I try to exploit when I'm doing a sketch. So how can I find shapes that are big, and then how can I find shapes that are small, maybe like these tree holes or these small pockets of mud and footprints that I can use to play against one another. So we have the contrast of warm and cool colors, dark and light, and big and small is what this one was about. So those are the tools that I'm trying to exploit. So we'll get more into that when we're actually sketching, and I can sort of show you with the brush the kind of ideas that I like to play with that stuff. So with that said, I would love to go ahead and sketch with you all so we can get to it. I have some stuff I could demo, but I'd almost rather just do it in the
Outside?
paint the house. Yeah, I mean we might as well, right?
We're ready.
You know, because it's sort of stopped raining.
Is it?
If you don't like the rain, if it starts up again, this is so cool in here. I don't mind just doing it in here. That kitchen's amazing. Like if I could just hoist the door open, I might just stand there and we can feel that rain. I love that kitchen. I open the door. It's gonna be hard not to think about that. Those are 4 buckets. So what I want to do is I want to evaluate the thing I'm looking at and find what interests me. One thing that jumps out to me, or the main reason why I wanted to be here, was that cool like fire thing on the house. So that to me is what drew me to doing this thing. I might actually see if I can. Is it gonna mess everybody up if I move over like however many 2 feet? I'll turn it a little more so that I'll see. I got myself behind that tree. So what I want to do is I want to evaluate this thing and then simplify this thing into 4 simple values. So when I'm talking about 4 simple values, I can okay, so I just want to see how far we can take the watercolor. So the one thing I think of when I think about mixing for watercolor is there's a kind of classic watercolor methodology called making a cup of tea. And So what that basically means to me is for our first level of value, I'm going to be applying what will look like the consistency of tea. So I'm going to use neutral tint here. And what I want is in the palette, I want it to look like tea in the well, in my mixing puddle. So you can see the white of the palette through. So I want it to kind of have that tea level consistency for my first layer. So this would be our kind of tea level for the watercolor. The next level we want is the milk level. A milk level, we want it to look kind of like milk in the palette. So I'm going to keep applying, and I'm not going back to the water source. I'm just going to keep adding pigment to that puddle until it starts. You see how you can't quite see the white of the well beneath it as well? Any water you have in a watercolor mix is going to greatly reduce the strength of the watercolor. It's going to dry a little bit lighter. So you always want to kind of paint on a bell curve. So this would be my milk level of watercolor. And then lastly, where we really want the strength of our watercolor is if I had the tube with me, I would pull straight from the tube. But what we want is the honey level of watercolor. So tea, milk, and then honey. So I'm not going back to the water source, and I'm trying to get rid of water. Get a little scratch paper towel. I'm gonna use my paper towel to get rid of some of the excess water here, so I can really dig out some rich, dark, neutral tint in this case. Okay. So any water you have in it, even if you're just cleaning your brush, is going to greatly weaken the watercolor. So I'm still digging. So now I've got a good rich, and that's even too much water. So go back a little bit more. And there we go. Something like that. And that's where you can really exploit some interesting dynamic brush strokes using dry brush, is when you're mixing at those darker levels with the watercolor. So these are my 4 kind of stages or buckets of value that I've got to work with. So what I want to do is take, these are my 3 simple lines for the haiku poem that I'm trying to create. So what I want to do is do a quick drawing of the scene. And what I like to do is, I often will, my honest preference is to do this stage at business card sized. I like, or credit card. If you take a credit card out of your wallet, you can trace a little rectangle. And I like to do business card, credit card size with about roughly a 1-inch flat brush is my preference. Because then you are forced to not fool with the details. We're thinking broad, big shapes. That's what we want to be after. So I like to apply 2 restrictions to this stage when I'm drawing. Well, when I'm doing the value study, which is at this stage, I'm not trying to render anything. I'm just trying to get the big shapes and think of the whole of what I'm looking at. So one thing I want to do is try to get this thing down in roughly 10 lines. If you're using more than 10 lines, you're probably communicating too much. So what I want to do is try to look at the scene and break it down into just 10 lines. That's the restriction. So we have 2 restrictions now we're applying to our sketching. 10 lines for the sketch and 4 buckets of value. So, you know, I like that spire thing. First I've got this tree that goes right all the way out. We'll go 1 for that. We have this hill. Alright, so there's 2. I've liked my spire. I'd like it to be somewhere around the 3rd. And it goes back in perspective. But I don't want to get, I'm not counting windows or the little kind of, you know, eaves and pieces that come out. I'll let the brush do that heavy lifting. We have a kind of, there's a bit of like an ocean wave behind it with those trees. Okay, there's my drawing, and half of you probably are wondering why. But that's what I want. Those are my big shapes that I want to convey. And then I want to allow the value and the brush to do the heavy lifting when it comes to texture and that sort of thing. So first, looking at this, I'm going to close one eye and squint. Everybody's familiar with the content and doing that. So I'm going to close an eye and I'm going to squint at what I'm looking at. And I'm going to try to consolidate value. So when you close one eye, you get rid of the depth perception. When you squint, you get rid of all the fussy detail, the little grill, all the windows and the little bits of detail. And you can see things a little bit more simply, which is what we want to do. So first I'm going to ask myself, what's the lightest thing I'm seeing? So, close an eye and squint. What do you all think?
Sky.
For sure, yeah. I can do that. So I'm going to mix up a key level first. Tap off the excess water, close an eye and squint, and then I'm just going to fill in everything but the sky. Let's go ahead and decide if I'm going to do that. Okay, and then I'm going to tap off the excess water, and I'm going to allow my rough side of the brush to do some of that retrieve. A 1 and a 2. What did I do with that? Here we go. I should take this up, but we have 1 and 2 figured out. Now I'm going to go for that next level of value. So, close an eye and squint. At this stage, the roof and the grass is pretty light, and the house is mostly shadow, or in that next tier, and then it takes up most of those trees. So, I am going to mix up that next level of value. And I'm just trying to think about the shapes that I'm seeing here. So we have that thing I like. Now. And then a really nice back shadow. But what I'm doing is I'm locking down the information in case the light changes. Like that. And then lastly, I'm going to get my honey level. We can close an eye and squint again and just think about what is yet darker than that. There's a couple little bits in the eaves, windows. Other side of this. that'll be a good place to exploit the contrast of thick versus thin. And treat. Okay. So there's my 4 buckets of value. Just pull the tape. So that's what I'm going to be after. We can pass it around, I guess. So this is my goal, and what I want to do is, this is kind of the mathematical equation or the algorithm. What I want to do is, this is my haiku poem. I want to take what I'm looking at and then convert it to this. So C in these big simple shapes. Pass it around. Prints the value study to see what my lightest lights were. You can even number it too. You could place on the value study like 1, 2, 3, 4, just so you kind of map it out ahead of time. But what I want to do is, I'm going to get this sky, which is very, very light. So I'll start by pre-wetting the whole thing, and then I'm going to put in the sky. And you can kind of put anything in because it's all, most of this is going to go right on top of it because it's all a darker value. So I'm going to start by pre-wetting it, and then I'll use some yellow ochre for the sky, and maybe a little bit of some blue towards the top. But it's very, very warm towards the base of that sky. Switch brushes when you're ready. But first I'm going to just pre-wet the whole thing. That way it's all moving. Okay. All right, so I'm going to get some yellow ochre. Gotta get that neutral tint off the brush. I put so much of it. So we'll get some yellow ochre, and we'll just start putting in the sky. Okay, I'm going to get a little bit of kind of lavender and gray just from the mix of the kind of previous mixes, and get some of that. There's a bit of dull gray from the clouds. You can kind of suggest a little bit there. And then I'm just going to get that little wisp of blue. So I'm using cerulean here. And all this is going to dry really light, so it's kind of not super important except to contrast all the rest of what we've got. So there's a bit of like a wisp of blue that kind of peeks in that way, and it kind of reaches across this way, like that. Okay, there's our sky. We're going to have to deal with the humidity bell curve. This is going to be mostly wet into wet, whether I want it to or not. So I'm going to go ahead and get some of these bright greens as we go down, because some of that can shine through when we put in the heavier values. So I'm getting some bright cad yellow light, and I can get some of those suggestions now. Just little bits peeking in. Most of that's going to get probably covered up by darker values, but you can set that in now. And then the grass is still going to be our next tier of value, but I'm going to go ahead and we can go ahead and get that in while I'm letting the sky. Typically, I would go ahead and paint the background trees so they sort of melt into the sky. If I do that now, because it's so humid, it's going to just dissolve. So I'm going to give it a second to get damp. And in the meantime, we can go ahead and block in some of the grass here. So we've got, it gets quite bright back there. We can use some cadmium yellow and then a little bit of burnt umber here and there, just because I don't want it to get too insanely saturated. But we'll get some good saturated grass there. And then I'm going to use some ultramarine and burnt umber and knock it down just a little bit as it rolls down the hill towards us. And then one thing I like to do, whether it's there or not in reality, is add a kind of cast shadow to the foreground, because what you do is you kind of insinuate that the world is bigger than the picture that you're painting. So I can add, also kind of suggest our hill a little better. Blue. And that'll help give us kind of context for the rest of the values that we put in. So I don't really want like a big perfect green space. So one thing you can do is you can kind of take your spray bottle and sort of barely squirt it, and you'll get some weird little splotchy bits. You could also flick water at it. But what I want to do is just break up that perfect shape. I don't want it to be too perfect. So I can break up the shape. Also just doing this too. We can flip some. And if it gets in the sky, you can just turn them into birds later. So while that's damp, I want to just kind of melt in some other values. And that'll do some of the heavy lifting of suggesting some of the contrast grass. Then we don't have to be quite as much fooling with the texture and things. You know, those little clean flicks of water kind of look like the little seed heads of the grass, clover, whatever you call those. So you can get some of those suggested, and then we don't have to fuss with wash or whatever later. Another thing I like to do too, if I want to bring back highlights or things, if there are some things that if there was some brighter bits of grass, I can use my thin knife. And I like to cut back bits of highlight here and there. I like it because it makes kind of awkward marks, which some people don't like. So you may not like that. You kind of have to find what you like. Anytime I teach an actual, like a class, I often will tell students, like, if you see a cool stick, pick it up and like try jamming it a little bit. See what kind of interesting textures and mark making you can create. All right, so let's switch to. I have a handful of these cheap Japanese brushes I really like because they're Chinese, I guess, calligraphy brushes, because they're not really made for watercolor, so they immediately do that, and then you get weird, cool texture. Yeah, so it's gonna just be wet the whole time, which is cool. One time I was painting in Alaska and I got stuck in a snowstorm, and I found a little like cave and I was able to paint through the cave, but the snow kept falling and rushing through, and it made like it ended up making like an interesting kind of, it looked like I had made snow. It wasn't me, it was just literal snow falling on it and making these kind of marks a little bit.
Is
So
that a watercolor?
here, but I'm getting a dull, I want it to be cooler because yellow is the weakest light wave. So objects that are green, when they go further back in space, they tend to look cooler blue and less saturated. So we want some burnt umber in the mix to dull down, decrease the strength of our green. And I want to push the contrast of the brighter greens here by having duller greens in the background. So it's another kind of contrast we can play with, is the contrast of saturation. But now I can start to try to exploit a bit of the contrast of thick to thin. So I've got a big shape here, this tree here, pine or whatever that is. It's got very thin branches I can put in. Dipole. If you take anything away from what I'm talking about, try to remember me obnoxiously in your ear saying, switch to warm, switch to cool. You can, people, everywhere you look, we have the warm light source of the sun, and we have the cool atmospheric light, the ambient from the curve of the sky, the rich kind of blue light. That blue light is a fill light. It's not strong enough to illuminate the area. It's only strong enough to fill the shadows. So our shadows are going to be filled with cool light. Our warm areas have the warm light. But the two are bouncing off everything all the time. So you constantly have warm and cool playing against one another and bouncing off one another all the time. So as I go, I'm filling in my swatch here of a shape. And I'm going back and forth from warm to cool to warm to cool. And I'm not indulging in detail yet. I'm just subdividing a little bit from where we were. Reload, go cool. Trying to just have that kind of soft edge suggest the grass and do the heavy lifting for me. Reload, cool. Here. Triangle there. Reload, favor warm. Okay. Now I can go back in and subdivide some of the smaller gaps and things that I see. Actually, this is the spot. So reload, favor cool, and we'll join this area back here, where the shrubs get really small. And in that area, facing away or towards us, there's even deeper shadow. So I'm going to go reload, favor cool, to get a nice rich blue back there for that. Where the, whatever that back extension of the house is. I don't love the placement of that gazebo because it would be dead center. So I'm either going to move it or just ignore it. Because it's just sort of, I like the house. And the gazebo's sort of distracting to me.
Are you rinsing between your warm and cool puddles?
No. Just kind of keep going back to the mix.
Are you dabbing out, or you've run out of the paint of the one color and then you just dab in the other?
A little bit. I mean, I'll tap the excess off on a paper towel,
Okay.
or I'm trying not to do it. Usually when I'm outside, I do this, but I'm afraid I'm going to blame it on people. So usually I go like that,
Yeah.
you know, and just get rid of the excess water. 'Cause you just don't want extra water. All right, so I'm going to get some of those. So burnt umber and cobalt blue. So getting a warm and a cool. And I can get some of these interesting. So we've got this, there's like a little top thing on the top of that, whatever you call that. Knows what a thing's supposed to look like, because ever since you're a kid, you develop this system of symbols that represent everything. That's how we navigate the world. We have little toy cars and things. So I'll be teaching plein air painting, and people will go to draw a car in the scene, and they'll do this, and they'll go, why doesn't it look real? What happened? Like, what happened? What happens is between the moment you're looking at the object and you're looking at your board, your brain goes, I know what a house looks like. So you'll go to paint that and you'll paint that. Or you'll go to paint a car and you'll paint that. Or you'll do a portrait. This happens every time I teach portraiture or figure painting. People go to paint a portrait and they'll paint that for the eye. The eye never looks like that. But people will go to paint that and they'll go, I don't understand why it looks like a cartoon. It looks silly. Well, it's because you're wired. That's how we navigate bathrooms, stopping your car. That's how we navigate the world, is symbols, this series of symbols that help us so that we don't have to constantly take in the complexity of reality. It's simplified by symbols. So what we have to do is intentionally kind of unhook those wires, and we can do that by simplifying, by close an eye and squint and just go for the most basic shape that you see. What's the basic shape you see? So that tree there, the basic shape is a circle, and then I can use the brush holding the handle farther back up, using a lack of water, and I can think about it as simple shapes and then join it with tree branches. But I'm doing that by purposefully disconnecting. If I'm trying to do this car, I close an eye and squint, and it's a cube in perspective, and then I've got wheels, the little bits in the front, the windshields are all a darker value. The whole car is a very light value, and the surrounding negative space is a darker value. So light, semi-dark, dark wheels, really dark wheel wells. But if I try to draw that car, looking at it and then going down to draw it, I'm going to end up doing this. So you want to constantly be working with your brain to disconnect those wires and allow a little bit of spontaneity. You can force by using a smashed brush and scumbling texture. Instead of trying to paint every leaf, we can flick some of it to suggest some of those tree foliage so that we don't have to do as much rendering. You know, it's on both sides. We have really nice. Get some of that cadmium yellow. We could even exploit the contrast of opposites by maybe flicking in a little bit of red into the tree as well. Would be something else we could do if you're a little bit more comfortable with paint. So we've got a big shape that goes like that. Goes down in front, and if I close an eye and squint, it is darker than the roof. So I want to have the tree stand out in front of the roof and the building, just a little bit. There's that. We'll join that to the shrubs. Same kind of mix. Use some cad yellow on the top to get some of that saturation. I'm going to cool it down a little bit as it goes further back. And once it's getting back here, I'm getting less and less specific and more abstract and simple. All right, we'll join that to the bottom of that shrub is touching that really nice, rich cast shadow. So we'll get that saturated green. It is a dull green that is illuminated by the rich, cool atmospheric light, but it's still a bright local color green. So I don't want to go too blue, but it is a blue influenced green. And it goes up the hill. All right, and then we'll get in our other one. A little bit of bright, saturated cadmium yellow to try to get some of those little bits here and there. And then we'll get our darker mix. We still haven't gone to that last level yet. We're still dealing with the kind of milk level of watercolor. So I want it to be, all right, and it's green, but duller green by just the nature of that tree. But I want to have a lot of saturation, so yellow ochre, so limited saturation, but more saturation than the distant trees, because I want to sell that this one is closer and push those other further back. So that's going to cover up part of that. Off that way. Reload. Get some of those sky holes. That's the top of the ice cream cone I talked about. And then we'll carry it down. If I close an eye and squint, it's a little bit darker than the house, so I can use that, trying to get that value a little bit darker as it moves down. And I'm holding the brush further back to keep myself from controlling too much, because I don't want to try to draw a tree here. I'm trying to just look for the big shapes. There's a big shape over here. Also, what is the tree doing too? Sometimes trees reach, sometimes they sag. You know, you can define, use that word as a definition for how you're going to apply your brush strokes. I try to think about that a lot when I'm doing skies and things, because it's so nebulous and it just moves constantly. So sometimes I'll try to look at it and apply some kind of describing word to it that I can then use with my brush stroke. So I want my brush to reach across, if it's clouds that are kind of like reaching across. If it's sitting or something like that, I'll try to apply that word in my mind so that my brush communicates that. This one also has a bit of a cast shadow, just the suggestion of the top of the hill. Maybe even some.
So now you're using less water?
Yeah, yes. So I'm doing the milk level.
Okay, and do you ever like go back to one of the previous levels after you've reached the milk level? Do you ever go back and touch in a little bit of like the tea level on some detail of the leaf, or do you just, once you reach that lighter level, that's it, you don't go back?
is entirely up to your patience and, I guess, style. I don't like to. I like to try to just keep moving forward, and I also tend to paint quite simply too. So the net result is I tend to paint a little bit more loose looking paintings, which may or may not be something that appeals to you. Like I said, my wife jokes, because my wife likes really highly detailed rendered watercolors, so she'll often joke with me that mine look unfinished. So, but I like what I like. I tend to prefer painters who are a little bit more loose. You know, if you were in the studio and you were like, had all the time to just sit and noodle away at the detail, then maybe. But for me, usually I'm trying to get it done in under an hour if I'm on location. All right, so I'm switching to this smaller brush because I want to try to exploit some of that thick to thin now. We've got a lot of big shapes, but they're all pretty equally treated. So I want to have a different kind of brush that I can get smaller details, and now we can add the contrast. We've got contrast of edges, contrast of warm and cool, contrast of saturation, and now everything is just big. So I want to have contrast of big and small as well, thick and thin. So holding the brush further back, we can get some of these branches reaching. And you can see that, you know, maybe hard to see back there, but you can see as I put in the smaller shapes, it will highlight the strength of the big shapes. So the big shapes highlight the strength of the small shapes. When two things oppose one another, it creates drama and interest. So I want to have the both, or otherwise everything's just one big thick shape. So everything is kind of reaching from this direction. I'm not counting branches, and I'm holding the handle far back so I can't control too much. Trying to eliminate the ability to control things. And then we've got a little bit of the trunk, and then a little bit more. Goes like that. I always try to pitch trees slightly at an angle because it's more dynamic and it looks more alive. And also because it's very easy. Another common thing people do with trees is you'll go to paint trees and you'll do this. And you'll create picket fences all over your painting. We don't want picket fence anything. Picket fence windows, picket fence is not what we want. We want a little bit of dynamic angle to it. It creates a little bit more drama. So I will pitch trees slightly more at an angle, and I can use my thumb to kind of push back some of those greens so that we sort of push the tree behind the foliage a little bit. And with thin to thicker, and it falls right at the base of that one.
Do you try to put like your lightest light next to your darkest dark?
I do when I have time to really analyze like a composition.
Okay.
That is the better strength. So I'm going to have most of those dark contrasts here, where I want to draw focus. At the moment, I'm just sort of still blocking in our big stuff, and then I'm going to tie it down now. So we'll finish it up here.
Have you ever heard of this idea called the no-tan?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That is similar to the method I use there, although I use 4. A no-tan would probably be like 3 values or 2 values. So it's like a value study that is extremely restricted, which is very handy and a very good tool to study because it forces you to think about simplifying. I tend to favor leaning on 4 values as my main, sometimes 5.
I only recently learned about that word.
Oh, no-tan painting? Yeah, no, it's a great, I mean, I think it's a good method to explore, like, you know, and some people just use that as a way to get the value study. It's essentially, I mean, in this context, it's a value study.
Okay.
But no-tan is just restricting the value to like 1 or 2 values as opposed to 4 or Flemish 9. So, All right, so I'm gonna put in the last bits of detail, and which will be our kind of our windows and little bits like that. So I'm gonna see.
And it kind of seems like you've only used maybe 3 different brushes on this.
Yeah, I only really use I usually only use 2 or 1 or 2. I like a big flat or a big squirrel for the first layer, the T layer level. And then I like to have a thin, this is another little Japanese brush. Just a cheap Japanese brush. I have some people that read my books in Japan, and they've sent me brushes,
Oh, that's nice.
which is nice. So I don't know where they came from, but except that they came from just the Japanese store, and everything in the packaging was all Japanese. So I don't know what they were, but I do like them. All right, I'm gonna favor warm on the downward facing planes. So yellow, lots of yellow ochre. And I'm just gonna subdivide one step more, getting in the windows and our patio and things like that. You can think about it like you're a little ant walking across the surface of something. And if you were to look up, that's the color that influences the color you're trying to mix. So if you picture you're a little ant and you're walking on the grass right here, and you look up, then you'd be looking at the sky and the warm light of the sky. If you walk into the shadow and you look up, you're seeing a lot of green light. So you've got a green influence in the color here. If you're walking up the wall here, if you walk up the wall and you get into the cast shadow, you see how it's kind of bluish? That's because at the lowest part of the cast shadow, if you're looking out at the sky, and it's quite blue. So it's filled with blue. And then if we keep going into the eaves there, you see how it gets very warm, kind of yellow ochre colored? That's because if you were to look out, you'd be looking down at the ground. The light's hitting the ground and bouncing back up into the downward facing plane. The planes that stick out. So the planes that face downward are going to be warm influenced. Warm. And the planes that face outward are typically either warm from the light or cool from the sky. So as I go, I'm going to think about those downward facing planes, and now I'm going into our last level, our honey level. And I can get just the suggestion of some of these downward facing planes. And then there's a little, the top of the roof has like a little, whatever you call that. Cap, the cap of the roof, yeah. There. And I'm going to get some ultramarine and burnt umber. When you're doing windows, I always favor warm. So favor burnt umber. I mix a dark by using ultramarine and burnt umber, but then I favor burnt umber on a window because you're insinuating light is passing through the window and kind of bouncing around. If you go cool on all the windows, sometimes you'll catch a window, but more often than not, a window is going to be kind of warm because it's the light sort of passing through and then bouncing around in the room that you're looking at. So we can get some of these bits. As often as I can, I try to do windows in one brush stroke. It's almost like a fake confidence. You kind of, even if it's not correct, if you put it down in one stroke, it somehow feels more correct, if that makes sense. Because there's like an element of confidence.
Like painting a whisker.
Yeah, yeah. And we got like a little. So the gutters are a good excuse to have some thin, but I want to have contrast of thick and thin. So some thin shapes. There's like a tiny window up there.
Excuse me. Thank you.
Okay. And then we have this door. And another window. And then a thinner window as it turns outward. And then I've got our little patio. I'm going to put a lot of yellow ochre in it, even though it's very dark, but I want it to be very warm. There we go. Thin shape there. And then turns the corner. It gets quite dark over there. Okay, and then underneath our cupola, it's quite dark there. There you go. Could add a little bit to the shrubs here and there. They're not. Leave it there. There's kind of a base of the house too, so it's a little ochre. And I'm just going to finish it with that. And that. So, from there, I would. That's as far as I would take it. You can mess with the values. You could erase stuff out, you know, or clean stuff up if you want to. When I'm like painting on location, I tend to like to just leave it as it is. But like you could use clean water, for example, and bring back, you know, some lighter values if you wanted to here and there. Like that one window is catching quite a bit of light, so I could take some clean water and scrub back some of that. Like that. If I wanted to catch some of that light. I mean, I could scrub back the gazebo or use gouache if I wanted to bring back some of that as well. But that's typically about as far as I usually like to take it. There is a nice little light area here that we could pull back with the clean water. Where in between the thing is catching light. But there you have it.
Excellent presentation.
Thank you. Really cool to take, and yeah, so it's a warped mess, you know, but I can from there I could wet the back. Part of that's because it was over doing. Anyway.
Yeah. Could you hold it up to the camera?
Oh yeah.
Thank you.
Oh my gosh, it's so nice in the shade.
Yes, it is.
You can pass it around. It's still very wet, but you know, you get the idea. So hopefully, in theory, we have taken this thing that's rather complicated, right, with all of the bits and bobs and pieces and foliage and all that kind of stuff. Okay. And I am going to cheat in the shadow. Hopefully we've been able to take the complexity, use our 4 buckets of value to be clear and concise. That's part of it too, is like, the reason I don't like to go back is because I want to be clear and concise as best as possible. So, kind of like with the haiku, I don't want to have a bunch of filler, like ums, in a haiku poem. You want to get to the point, you know what I mean? So I think that's part of why, to me, even though maybe it's more loose than some people prefer, the idea is there. The haiku is there in a sense. I don't want to have too many and when I'm restricting the levels that I'm willing to go. So we have, hopefully the two kind of match, and we took the kind of complexity of reality and we're able to boil it down into our 4 value steps rather. Do it like that. There you go.
That probably keeps you from overworking it too.
Yes.
Because you don't go back into it and then you end up with mud and...
Yeah. I think watercolor too depends on an element of, I liken it to a nosedive. Like a lot of watercolor to me, more so, and I think I have this problem, because when I paint oil, about 45 minutes, I start panicking, like I should be finishing. And then I'll try to rush it, and then the values are out of whack and the color doesn't work, and then I've put too much white in it and now the whole thing looks like milk. You know, it's like oil gets away, if I don't have time to just sit in oil and like think through, like strategize like chess, then it's a mess. If I approach it like watercolor is the opposite to me. Watercolor, in my opinion, like when you look at people like Sargent, Eakins, Wyeth, you know, throughout history, I feel Homer, you know, I feel like a lot of what you see in really successful watercolor is clear, simple value structure, and then a willingness to just go for it. You know, especially with someone like Sargent, where it's like, if you're looking at them, I got in Philadelphia 5 years ago, they had a Homer and Sargent watercolors exhibit. It was amazing, and it was tons of their watercolors and side by side, so you could see how Sargent handled boats next to Homer's boats, and then whatever, you know. And Sargent's, the thing that was so contrasted was it was just like, you would think it was like a Rothko up close. It was just like cadmium orange and cerulean blue, and you're up close and it's like, this looks like a modern art thing. It doesn't make sense. And you take a step back and you're like, oh my gosh, it's an Italian like cathedral with people and all this stuff. It's like, it's in the simplicity though. That's what I think, you know, that's what made Sargent so strong, is he was able to really simplify and then exploit those contrasts, the contrast of warm and cool, thick and thin, big and small, and all those things to set the stage. So I try to keep that in mind. It's like to try to stay clean, clear, and simple. And the drawing stage and the value stage is kind of like getting the plane up. And then when you're going into that phase, like when I was pre-wetting it and doing the T level, I'm slinging it basically, because that to me is like you tip the nose. And it's more about correcting, I don't like to say mistakes because that implies you could do something wrong with paint, but it's more about the correcting the angle than it is about sniping or hitting the right color. We can't quite window shade like with oil paint, where you go piece by piece and you just, I mean, there are people who can. I'm not saying it's everything I say. I feel like that as a hard and fast rule, there's some professional who completely does the opposite and does amazing work. So for me though, it takes the confidence of tipping the nose and then correcting the descent. And it's more about correcting the descent than it is trying to land perfectly. And then you pull the nose up, or you crash and start over. Go pick something else, because the light's changing and you're having to constantly change what you're doing. But hopefully, you know, I went mostly from this, which I was able to map out. And you know, if I was by myself, I would have done it in 3 minutes. But you could, even if I just have 2 minutes, I can do it with a pencil. Even you don't have, this isn't not like a crucial element. I'm not doing this to hang on a gallery wall or whatever. It's just to get the idea down, and then to lock in some of those things. Because, and you know, in like 5-10 minutes, like probably one of the faces of the walls will be hit by light, and then the whole thing is different. Like, so maybe this whole face ends up hit by light. I don't know what angle it's from, but you know, at some point, one of the faces is going to be hit by light. It's going to completely change. So there's a very frustrating element to setting up and then trying to paint, and then the values completely shifting on you immediately. So.
I was just going to say, your work looks a lot like Edward Hopper.
Oh, geez. Well, that's very nice of you.
No, but the simplicity and how the light hits. I mean, that's what
Yeah.
it is. Yeah, and even like you were mentioning, Monet is one of those examples where you look close and it's like, what
Right.
are you doing? And then you back up.
Yeah, you step back and it's amazing.
that's, I think, one of the things that appeal to me about watercolor is the magic. It's almost like a sleight of hand magic trick, whereas you give the person A and C and the brain creates B, and it like comes together. Like you think about these puzzle pieces and you put them together, and sometimes it works better than others, but you know, up close, I think probably these areas would look a little bit silly, but it's standing far back, you know, that hopefully the thing comes together. So cool. Well, we can break up and paint. What's the? I don't know what time it is.